Okay, it's 12 p.m., so I guess I can say good afternoon, everyone. And thanks for being here today for the first webinar of the year presented by Behavioral Economics in Action at Trotman Research Center, also known as BEAR. Although we're meeting remotely, we wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississauga of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across the Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Let me briefly introduce myself. I'm Nicola Setera. I'm one of the chief scientists at BEAR, and I will serve as the moderator for today's webinar. We're very happy to have Professor Eva Vivalt from the University of Toronto. Before I introduce her, just let me go through some ground rules for this webinar. Throughout the session, please submit your questions by clicking the Q&A tab, which should be either at the top or the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can type your questions or comments there. And at the end of Eva's talk, if there is still time, we will have a short Q&A session in which I will select some questions and from the tab. Now, Eva. Professor Vivalt is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Toronto, and she's also the director of the Global Priorities Institute at the University of Oxford. Dr. Vivalt's main research interests are policy decisions that include studying methodological issues, how evidence is interpreted, and the use of forecasting. In fact, Dr. Vivalt is also principal investigator of 3 guaranteed income randomized controlled trials and founder of the Social Science Prediction Platform, a platform to coordinate the collection of forecasts of research results. Thank you, Eva, so much for being here today, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Really excited to be here. So I will share my screen. Oops. Sec. Great. Can everybody see that? So very happy to be here presenting this joint work with Elizabeth Rhodes, Alex Bartik, David Brockman, and Sarah Miller. The question we're interested in is, how does income affect employment outcomes? This is an important question because cash transfers are one of the primary tools that policymakers have to provide some sort of safety net for low-income households. Recently, the US government has been spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year on cash transfers through programs such as the Child Tax Credit, the Earned Income Tax Credit, and temporary aid to needy families, just to name a few. And a number of other cash transfers have also recently been proposed. And yet, despite all this spending, there's still uncertainty, both about effects on labor supply as well as about effects on other important outcomes. So we conduct a randomized controlled trial of a program that provided $1,000 a month unconditionally for 3 years to 1,000 people in the treatment group, with a control group receiving $50 a month unconditionally for the same period. We leverage a really rich array of data, including administrative records, in-person or over-the-phone surveys, online surveys, and data from a custom mobile phone app. We think this is the most comprehensive such study to date in terms of the breadth and depth of the outcomes considered. So we look at a large number of outcome variables. I've listed some of them here. Income and labor supply are naturally on this list. Now, there have been a number of studies that have estimated different kinds of labor elasticities, et cetera. Yet, we noticed that there was still quite a lot of disagreement amongst experts as to what the effects of this program might be. In fact, we solicited forecasts on the social science prediction platform, which is a platform that Stefano Della Vigna and I set up to enable researchers to collect forecasts of what their own studies will find. And when we surveyed NBR members and other super forecaster types, we found that indeed there was quite a lot of variation in what they thought we would find for effects on income and labor supply, suggesting that there's still quite a lot of uncertainty here. Then we also are interested in time use. So if people work a little bit less, then what do they do with their time instead? This is important from a policy perspective for two reasons. First, a policymaker might think that there are some uses of time that are more productive than others. For example, if people start a business or go back to school, or if they're raising children or taking care of elders. So it's important for that reason for them, but also, in the same way that we think that spending money tells you something about what makes people well off, then how people spend their time also gives you some indication of that. So if you're thinking about how to improve people's well-being, it's also, good to know how they're spending their time. Then we look at income, we look at labor supply and time use, and a variety of things connected to kinds of productivity. So entrepreneurship, human capital formation, etc. I also want to particularly highlight quality of employment, because there's been an active debate in the literature with some people saying, well, if you give people more money, extend their benefits somehow, then they'll be able to search longer for better fitting jobs. They'll be able to quit the bad jobs. And so ultimately, quality of employment should go up. On the other side of the literature, there are people who say, well, if people can search longer for work, they might stay unemployed for longer, and their skills will degrade over that time, actually. And then by the time they find a job, it will actually be a worse job. So we can help to answer this question because we have all this really rich data, so very detailed amenities. So we'll get into that as well. And there's another of other topics. We'll see if I have time to cover them all today. So what do we find overall? Well, for every dollar given, total individual income, excluding the transfers, decreases by at least 12 cents, and total household income by at least 21 cents. Participants reduce their labor hours by about 1.3 to 1.4 hours of work, and there are very large spillovers within the household. Essentially, participants' partners are reducing their labor hours by a comparable amount. They spend this extra time largely on leisure, as well as some amounts on transportation and finances. We see increased interest in entrepreneurship. This doesn't translate into increased actual businesses started, but they're the precursors to starting a business. Some signs, suggestive signs of human capital formation amongst younger people in the sample, which makes sense. Younger people have more time that they could benefit from going back to school. They'll be able to potentially be able to leverage that for more work years, right? But we see no impacts on quality of employment. And this is across any dimension asked about. We have like 40 some questions, and they're just all completely flat. So what do we do exactly? Well, here's a timeline of the study. Actually, I've been working on this since 2016, but we started recruitment in late 2019 after we had worked out all of the details. We did our enrollment and baseline survey starting around that same time period. So people were being recruited. They start to take the baseline survey as part of enrollment. We did the randomization in October 2020, and the transfers started November 2020, and they ran through October 2023. Throughout this entire time period, as soon as people were enrolled, they started to take some online surveys themselves, as well as completing exercises on this mobile phone app that was designed for this study. Then we had a midline survey that we did about 1.5 years after the transfers began, and an endline survey about 2.5 years after the transfers began. We didn't want to put the endline right at the end because then we might capture the effect of losing the transfers. We ask people if they're feeling stressed, and they're like, yes, I'm stressed. I'm losing the transfers next month. So we wanted to have it a little bit before then. And we are doing some follow-up data collection to learn more about also what happens after the end of the transfers. But that's not something I'll be talking about today. So this was a program that was implemented by two nonprofit partners, one in Illinois and one in Texas. You can think of essentially targeting a 2-hour radius around Chicago and Dallas. It was intended for people aged between 21 and 40, so relatively young people. Who might still change their trajectories and not have much savings, so it might go farther. And it was targeted at people whose total household income in the year before enrollment was under 300% of the federal poverty level. Now, the federal poverty level, differs a little bit by household size. And this was targeted more at those in the lower bins here. So more people in the 0 to 100% of the federal poverty level bin than in that top bin, 201% to 300% of the federal poverty level. Just for context here, some social programs, start to phase out around, might phase out around something like 250% of the federal poverty level. So, even though 300% of the federal poverty level maybe sounds high, it's not that much actually. The average total household income in the year before the transfers began for people in our sample is just a little bit less than $30,000 a year. And you might, in fact, ask, so what does happen to other benefits that people were receiving? Well, these were largely preserved. So in Illinois, I'll say more about how these were preserved in just a minute, but we were able to protect SNAP and TANF. In Texas, Texas is a low benefit state. And so we couldn't protect benefits in Texas, but we're not as concerned about that, given that the benefits were very small and that people could get right back on SNAP and TANF after the end of the program. Now, if you were receiving some particularly large benefits like housing assistance or SSI, then you were simply not eligible to participate because the fear was that, if the programs were not careful about this, then people could actually be made worse off. They could lose their housing assistance that might in monetary terms actually be worth more even than the transfers. So, because these people were already receiving large transfers, they themselves were not eligible, but everybody else was. And I'll tell you more about what the sample looks like in a moment. But first, how did we get these benefits preserved in Illinois? Well, we actually worked with some local partners, and there was a law passed which protected these benefits, which was fantastic. So that was quite nice. So for recruitment, how did we do recruitment? So this was largely through mailers. Essentially, we sampled addresses in those eligible tracks. Again, think around Chicago and Dallas from the USPS DSF. And then a commercial vendor appended some information, some demographic information that we could use to pre-screen because we're targeting lower income people, right? And so most of the mailers were pre-screened, but some of them were untargeted. And then we also had a small share of people recruited through other means, including Propel, which is a app people can use to check their food stamp balance. So there'd be a little ad there. And no matter which way you came into the sample, the invitations all said, would you like to be part of a program in which you could receive $50 a month or more? So this is important because the control group does not realize at any point that they are in the control. Everybody starts off receiving $50 a month during the enrollment period, because as soon as you're enrolled, you start getting $50 a month. You're told there'll be a certain time that this 3-year time period begins. And so the control group is told, okay, now for the next 3 years, you're getting this $50 a month, and then it'll end. The treatment group is told, actually next month, you'll notice your transfers are now $1,000 a month for the next 3 years. So this sort of summarizes how our recruitment went. Mostly mailers, as I say. We got a little over 43,000 people completing this eligibility screener. That eligibility screener also asked if you would like to provide consent for sharing your administrative records. So things like unemployment insurance records, etc. And you don't have to, but it was an option there. From that screener, we noticed there was about 14,000 some people who were actually eligible. And then we did two randomizations. First, a randomization for people we would just never contact again. We might look at their administrative records later on, but we just never contact them again. And then another set where we do sort of attempt enrollment. Now, this attempt enrollment is a little bit perhaps misleading here, because we sent a list to the SRC at Michigan that did the enrollment and did the surveys, the baseline, midline, endline. And they went down the list until they hit 3,000 people. So it's not as though they used that whole list. They just, used 3,000 people that they, got those 3,000 people. And then this study is really focusing in on that second randomization between the treatment group and control group here. Treatment group, 1,000 people, control group, 2,000 people. That is the comparison we're going to be focusing on here. So what does the sample look like? Well, we made some comparisons to the American Community Survey. So you can see, going from the unweighted full US population in column 1, if you look at panel A for a moment, most people who are below 300% of, most people who are here are like above the 200% threshold for the federal poverty level, right? But we wanted fewer people in that top bin and more people in that bottom bin, the lowest income bin. So as we were randomizing people into being part of the study to potentially, attempt enrollment with, we were certainly paying attention to that. And not when we were randomizing between treatment and control, but just, trying to get the sample that we wanted. Also remember that this was around Chicago and Dallas. Those are large urban areas. So we were more likely to have people responding from these large urban areas, right, to just answering the screener. So if you reweight the ACS data and you move from column 1 to column 2, you can see, panel A changes to sort of match our study sample. You can see how panel B, which has the demographic characteristics, how that changes. And that you can look even more specifically at the study counties in column 3. Column 4 gives you the mailer respondents, and then column 5, the enrolled active survey group. So this is, treatment and control, those 3,000 people. Column 5 uses data from the baseline survey rather than the screener. We don't have screener data for the, we don't have the baseline survey data for people who only did the screener, who didn't progress past that. So that's why for column 4, you're going to have, somewhat different numbers, et cetera. And what you can see here is that the people who ended up in our sample in column 5 look pretty similar to the full population once it's weighted for the groups that we're targeting and the geographic locations. If anything was a little bit different, we have slightly more females in our sample. They responded more to the mailers. They had maybe a little bit more likely to have a college degree, maybe a little bit more likely to be renters. But the numbers don't look too terribly different here, actually. These are not, there's not a particularly weird sample, it seems. And then if we do some, baseline covariance balance checks here, we can see that, indeed, things are balanced on the relevant things we're looking at. We can see that, the typical person lives in a household of about 3 people. About 57% of them have children. About 20% have a bachelor's degree. About 60% are employed at baseline. And the total household income in the year before this study began, as I was saying earlier, is just shy of $30,000. About 20% of people, well, 17% of people have a second job. So you can sort of get to a sense of, this sample, okay? Now, I want to tell you a bit more about the data. We were really excited about our data. We had these great in-person and phone-based surveys at baseline, midline, endline for the highest priority outcomes. And we had amazing response rates. For the midline, 97% response rate overall, and for the endline, 96% response rate overall. Now, bear in mind that recruitment lasted about a year. So there had been some people who were in the sample for even like 2.5 years at the time of the midline, and some people who had been in the sample for 3.5 years at the time of the end line. So this is really good. We also had some short mobile surveys that also had, pretty good response rates overall as well, and pretty limited differential attrition. So it's worth talking a little bit about how are those response rates so high. And the monthly surveys probably did help. People could update their contact information. We did do pretty extensive outreach to people who are non-respondents. This advanced locating efforts, this is largely Elizabeth Rhodes, one of the PIs, doing a lot to really try to reach people. Like I remember we would have a team call and she would say, "Oh, I just got a notification on my watch that somebody got out of jail. Time for them to do the survey." So, there were really extensive efforts here. She invented a font that actually looked like her own handwriting. So she could send out these postcards, which had a QR code and the logo of the study on them, with some kind of, pre-populated text message on them that she could, also add, her signature, et cetera, to really try to, get people's attention, get them back into the sample. Okay. Then we have administrative data. So today I'll be talking about data that includes stuff from the National Student Clearinghouse, which is a data set that has 97% of US educational institutions over the transfer period of interest here. And about 87.5% of participants consented for us to link these records. Is information on, your enrollment and post-secondary programs, progress in your degree, fields of study, et cetera. We also are looking at Experian credit report data for debt. And this will largely be in another paper, but it will come in here as well. We also have got unemployment insurance data, but that's not in this presentation today. There's just disclosure rules we're still working through. So because we have all this data on all these outcomes, we had to do something to deal with this. And we did two things. So first, we put the questions in a hierarchy. So within a particular topic, so say employment, we had certain, different families of outcomes. So I already mentioned one of the families of outcomes we care about is quality of employment. But then there's a lot of different dimensions to quality of employment too. So for example, a lot of lower income individuals have a really hard time getting enough hours at work, enough shifts. And so adequacy of employment might be one reasonable component under the quality of employment family. And then how is that measured? Well, we might have several primary items, such as a question asking whether you would prefer to work more hours in your current main job that tries to get at that component. So you can think of this like a tree, okay? And then what we're going to do, so we're always going to present the raw primary items in their original units, but we're also going to combine the primary items within the components, combine the components within families, making a standardized index, essentially. And this will help to reduce the number of primary hypothesis tests. In some cases, we also have secondary items. This would come up, for example, where maybe there's a set of questions that's not asked to everybody, like a set of questions asked to people who left a job. And we still want to know the answer to those questions, but not everybody answered it. So we don't want to sort of throw it in the index with everybody else, so just a small little subgroup that answered that one. So we have some secondary items like that. Okay, so the first thing we do is we put all of our outcomes in an index. But then another thing we do is to do some multiple comparison adjustments using the false discovery rate, following the approach of Guess et al. Then the estimation strategy is really straightforward. This is an RCT, so we can just do regression with lasso selected controls. And we have a number of robustness checks in the paper, such as not using controls, doing median regression, differences in differences, relying only on the midline and endline data, and doing Lee bounds for the very minimal attrition that we had. So that's our main approach. Turning to the results. So first, at a high level, where does a dollar go? Well, about 22 cents on the dollar, that's our best estimate right now, goes to leisure, essentially. So it's reduced total household income. We also see, if anything, a little bit of net borrowing. So rather than, you might think of asset accumulation, but actually we see a little bit, if anything, it's negative slightly, but that has fairly large confidence intervals around it. It's imprecisely estimated. So, and then sort of this residual category is other expenditures. And of course, so here, this is just presented as a residual. We do have really detailed consumption surveys. This is largely in the household finance paper, Bartik et al. And some things to note there. People are spending more on things like rent and food, and also on cars and gas, as well as other things. So if you're interested, I refer you to that paper. Here, we're just going to say, the big picture is we're pretty confident about, the estimates of reductions of labor supply. We're pretty confident about debt because that comes from Experian, right? And people report their savings reasonably well, we think. In the literature, it's a lot harder to capture all the sources of consumption. Like the Consumer Expenditure Survey, for example, might only capture 75% of consumption itself. So, we're going to be missing a little bit here, but it's very, very detailed, I think. So let's talk through some of these results in more detail. Let me explain how to read this figure, because there's a lot going on here. So first of all, this is in terms of thousands of dollars, excluding the transfers, what happens to income. And here we're going to look at just a pooled measure across midline and endline, putting 30% weight on midline, 70% weight on endline, just getting one number from this. So you can see the control mean has gone up pretty substantially over this time period. If you remember, the baseline was about $30,000 for your total household income. Here we're already up to 48,000 some dollars in the control group. This happened to have been over a time period in which incomes and lower income groups especially were really increasing quite a bit. And also, in any case, there's a lot of times in which people are sort of transiently low income. So this also, a little bit reflects that. So you can see, the control mean, the standard deviation in parentheses, then the effect. So for total household income, that's about, a decrease in $4,000 a year, roughly. The stars indicate significance at conventional levels, and then the daggers illustrate what that looks like once you've adjusted for the false discovery rate corrections, okay? You've got the marginal propensity to earn, and this is a range because the marginal propensity to earn will depend a lot on how people are essentially, well, think of people making two decisions. First, a decision how much to consume today in some form, whether that's consuming leisure or consuming goods, and then how much to save for the future. So how much you're going to consume today versus later. And how you make that first choice is going to, really make a difference for your estimate of the marginal propensity to earn. It's very much analogous to, if you're familiar with like the discount rate also mattering in these kinds of calculations. So we have a range there based off of values we think are reasonable given our data, and an elasticity as well. Now we've got a few different numbers here. So all of this is based off of survey data. What we did to elicit this was first we asked people for just one number for your total household income and one number for your total own income. But then we ask you to break down your total own income into different categories. And we can sum that up to can create the sort of calculated total household income measure. So the ones that say self-reported here, those are just the one number ones, okay? And the other ones are, you have these more detailed broken down categories. And so you can see maybe people do remember a little bit more sources of income. If you ask them category by category, you can see the control mean even goes up. The effect is a little bit smaller when you do this calculated thing, but still pretty reasonable. And we didn't do the breakdown for the total household income because there's a literature that suggests that people are not very good actually at knowing what their spouse earns or other people in their household earn. So we thought that would be kind of hopeless. But you can create a kind of crude constructed adjustment of the total household income effect, if you would like, just by sort of using the difference between the total individual income that was calculated from the detailed categories and that one number that they gave. Now, to support this further, I want to show you some results for the labor supply as well as for time use, because they're all going to sort of, you'll see that they'll reinforce each other. So we see labor supply declines, about 2 percentage points fewer people work at all. And then work hours per week here in these questions goes down by about 1.3 hours a week. And these are all unconditional measures, I should say. So, you can see about 3/4 of people are employed in the control group, and those hours worked per week, everybody's pretty much if you're working 40 hours a week. I know a lot of people have in mind a model where there's people working a lot of jobs, maybe many hours, over 40 hours a week. In our sample, if you're working, it's most, there's a huge spike at 40. Of course, there's a distribution, but there's a huge spike at 40. If you think of like 3/4 of people working roughly 40 hours a week, you get your 30 some control mean hours worked per week. So that's how to interpret that. So these all like unconditional, right? And so if you think about it, well, our participant sort of calculated income measure, there was the treatment effect represented about 4.1% of the control mean. And for participant hours, it's actually really close to that. It's 4.2% of the control mean. So this is the sense in which, they maybe reinforce each other a bit. And then we also asked about other household members. And here you can think of, okay, well, about 1/3 of people have a spouse or partner. And so their spouse or partner, if they have one, also is working, 40, if they're working 40 hours a week. So, think of like 1/3 higher than the 30 we saw before. You see your control mean, and actually the effect is also about 1/3 more. It's also about like 1-to-1 here. Now, these are all either secondary or post pre-analysis plan measures. So they're all going to be italicized, and these ones are deprioritized for the false discovery rate corrections. So nothing here is going to like survive the false discovery rate corrections, but that's understandable because they're sort of at the bottom of that hierarchy. I think this is still very meaningful though. And then if you try to, again, make this kind of comparison to what we saw for income, well, the total household self-reported income, when you just gave one number, was about 8.6% of the control mean. If we tried to adjust that for the self-reporting in that very crude way, that was 5.1%. And you get something, again, kind of similar if you look at the household hours. Okay. Then finally, we asked people questions about time use. So we had on the app, they could fill in on 2 randomly selected days per month. Sorry, a weekend day and a weekday day. What they did over the last 24 hours. And you could have multiple activities at the same time if you like. But this is what that looked like. We also asked standard American time use survey style questions as well, and the results line up very closely. But let me just show you the results from the mobile app here. Well, you see market work declines by about 9 minutes a day. Again, this is unconditional, so this includes like weekend days. Other income generating activities goes down by about 3 minutes a day. And so if you were to add them up, okay, that's about a decline in 12 minutes a day over the course of 7 days. That actually translates to 1.4 hours of work a week reduction. So yes, the confidence intervals are pretty large here, but at least, it's in the same ballpark as what we were seeing for some of the other survey questions. Now, what did that time go to? Well, largely leisure. So largely social or solitary leisure. If you add them up, it looks like that's where it's going to. We also used an LLM to classify these other activities into the different categories. And that turned out to largely be leisure as well. By the way, I should say these are our categories that we pre-specified. These are not the categories that people would, enter themselves when they're entering things into the time diary, which would use more natural language. Okay. So we also saw, other kinds of similar evidence that people were, of course, working a little bit less. They might be searching for work longer. The length of time that they spent in non-employment and in unemployment increased. Depending on the exact measure, you're going to have some slight differences, such as if you're asking about, we constructed these detailed work histories because we asked very frequently if you started or left a job. And so we can piece together your entire work history and use that for some of these. Or we can just ask you a question, at a point in time, whether you are unemployed or non-employed, also the number of months you were not employed in the last year, et cetera. I should say, so now that we've moved on to these tables, we are into the world of indices. So the items in bold here are the index level in standard deviations. The rest are the raw units here, okay? We have just a single item component that was pre-specified here. We also see that treated participants are going to search more for work, although less intensively. So here, the overall index, there was no significant impact in standard deviation. You can see a couple of, there's a component here, an active search component, that also was not significant. But if you go down to the items in the raw units, then you can see, okay, well, people are maybe more likely to search for a job and to apply for a job, but the number of applications you send is smaller. So, maybe you're being a little bit either more selective or searching less intensely here, okay? We see no effect on preferences for employment. You still, want the same amount of employment. And we also see a lot of interest in entrepreneurship. Now we have 3 components in this family. 2 are on this side, 1 is on the next one. So the overall index measure, you can see increases by about 0.05 standard deviations. The 3 components were entrepreneurial orientation, which is essentially how willing are you to take financial risks? This was one of the measures where we had to sort of flip the sign of this gamble. This was a real gamble that they did prior to combining it into the component, because it's one of the ones where, a low value actually represents you're more willing to take financial risks. We also have entrepreneurial intention. So, are you interested in starting a business? And this also seemed to go up. When we turn to actual entrepreneurial activity, we did not see any effects. However, I will say that, if you look across time, more and more people are starting a business. Year 3, it's like barely insignificant. So, maybe later on in time, maybe it just takes time to start a business, right? Yeah, so there's a lot more that could potentially be going on there. We had deliberately done these other components because we thought, very few people might be entrepreneurs, actually. Entrepreneurship is not something that is necessarily, it's stressful. It's not necessarily something that everybody wants to do, actually. So we better have some other sort of precursors to entrepreneurship. And we do see, pretty large effects there. So I think, we will certainly return to that after some time has passed to see what happens after the study ends. Now, there are some suggestive signs that people might pursue more education, but younger people amongst our sample. So remember, our sample is age 21 to 40 at baseline. Now, education, of course, benefits younger people more. So we pre-specified that we're going to do some heterogeneity analyses here. And in fact, for those who are under 30, it did seem like maybe they had more formal education. Maybe they enrolled more in post-secondary programs. I should say that, of course, this does not survive the false discovery rate corrections, but hardly any subgroup analysis is really going to, right? Because these ones are like really deprioritized. They're last in our sort of how we're doing those corrections. So, maybe there's something here for those who are under 30. It's a little bit, suggestive only. Quality of employment, I said there's just no change. It's totally flat. We had 6 components under quality of employment. Let me tell you what they were. So we had adequacy of employment, which we already discussed. This is, whether you would like more hours at work, essentially that you're not able to get at your main job. Then also a component that looks at things like benefits that you might receive or training, some amenities, essentially. We have this single item component here. So because the single item, we have your control mean and everything is in raw units. Whether the respondent reports working any informal job. The other components are these standardized measures, but when we have this a single item component, also like the hourly wage, this is what it says on the tin. If anything, your hourly wage goes down, but it's not significant at all. And then stability of employment and quality of work life. And I would distinguish quality of work life from the employment quality component because the quality of work life component is more about your day-to-day experience on the job. So, for example, does your manager treat you fairly? Do you feel discriminated against at work? And things like that. Okay. And if I had time, which I really don't, but I will quickly show you that if you break it down by primary items, it's not that it's not significant because of false discovery rate corrections or something. It's just flat. It's just nothing. Nothing for any of these things. Maybe something for how many jobs you've held in the past 12 months or the past 2 years, but that's actually getting at the labor supply more than stability per se. Maybe we shouldn't have included it in this component. Quality of work life, again, there's just nothing. And we have all these things, maybe there's something here, maybe it's a little bit more stressful. But with so many items, some of them are going to be bound to be significant by chance. So I wouldn't really put too much emphasis on a few things being like at the 10% level, saying something like, if anything, something is negative, but these are basically just a flat zero is I think the way to interpret this. We also don't see any reduction in barriers to employment. You might think, it helps people potentially get childcare and therefore, help in some way, but there's just nothing here. We do see people moving quite a bit. I could go into this a lot more if there were time. You might think, okay, some of these other results, if we see total household income is falling, is that because people are moving out of the household? Well, no, actually, the households are relatively stable. People are moving, but not out of the household. Also, if anything, there's maybe some churn in relationships with people outside the household, but not so much really within the household. Okay. And yeah. So we did do some comparisons to forecasts that were elicited and on the social science prediction platform of NBR affiliates and other SSPP super forecaster types, people who take a lot of these surveys. And what we see is that our results maybe show somewhat larger negative impacts than people expected, although for the labor supply estimates, the NBR affiliates were not that far off, really. It's within the confidence intervals for a lot of them. But there are other things that once you go outside of that, they got a lot more wrong. So for example, they thought that people would search less for work. Actually, people search more for work, which makes sense because fewer people are working. Maybe they were thinking of the less intensive part. I'm not sure. For duration of unemployment, also, if you look at it, average hourly wage, they thought that there would be some small increase. Actually, if anything, there's a small decrease. These results, I should say, are all at end line or the last period that we have them for. And post-secondary enrollment, again, they thought maybe things would go up quite a bit, actually. By end line, it was just nothing, actually. And another brief point in discussion here, I think making comparisons to other studies. So there have been a range of studies, especially lottery studies, that are maybe the closest to ours because they also estimate a pure income effect. And some have found larger effects, some have found smaller effects. We're neither the largest nor smallest. Though we're larger than most, I would say. We're on the larger side. But also, it kind of highlights a big difference in how people are saving for the future versus not. So our sample is basically spending all the money that's coming in, which is fine. I mean, taking on debt is not necessarily a bad thing. People with higher income do have more debt. But it does sort of influence your estimates of the marginal propensity to earn because, again, this sort of how much you're allocating to the future will impact how much you're making your decisions over today, which will affect your marginal propensity to earn. So for us, some of these other studies out there sort of imply that people are saving much more than we see. We don't see people saving it. They're just spending it pretty much and borrowing it, if anything. Okay, so to sum up, we see about 2 percentage points fewer people work, about 1.3 to 1.4 hours a week less overall. They mostly are substituting into leisure, although there's some interest in entrepreneurship, some sign that younger people might be going back to school more. There's no evidence of people finding better work. And so this all suggests that if there'll be productivity gains, that might take more time to materialize. And our results also, sort of emphasize the importance that participants place on leisure and on spending on the transfers on different purposes as well. Some people are going back to school, some people are buying a car. There's many more results in the paper. I'm already out of time, so I'll stop there.
Thank you Thank you so much, Eva. This was super interesting and impressive. I mean, these kind of studies, as you mentioned, take a long time and bravery and patience. So given also the importance of the topic, I mean, we should all be grateful that someone does this. So I had a few questions to just break the ice, and if anybody has other questions, please add them to the chat. So you mentioned the forecast by experts, by other forecasters, and so on. How about you? What were the results that sort of, let's say, surprised you on the one hand, and were you hoping somehow for something different? What given this policy and the discussion about this kind of policies, what were you thinking could have happened that could be socially beneficial?
Yeah, no, thanks. So I think we were surprised that, given the magnitude of the transfers, which were, representing, roughly 40% of the total household income in the year before this study, that's a fairly large increase that the transfers represent. And so we thought we would see more effects on other things. So, maybe more people would go back to school. Maybe more people would, get more healthcare and stuff. And so
Right.
it was actually a little bit surprising that not so much changed. Now, that could just be that also people are using it for different purposes. And so that's certainly possible. But yeah, that was one thing that was surprising. And I think, of course, I think we would have all liked to have seen it have some great transformative effects, on, say, the quality of jobs or something. But yeah, it was just a flat zero.
Yeah, which is interesting in itself, obviously. So the usual acronym galore. So Daz is asking, what does SNAP stands
Oh,
for,
sorry.
and TANF?
Yeah, so supplemental nutrition assistance for families, I think. Oh, no, sorry.
Right, program.
That's
Yeah.
a supplemental nutrition assistance program and temporary aid to needy families. There, I merged them, but that's what they are. So these are essentially, think of like food stamp type
Food
programs.
stamps. Right. Which is an interesting question in itself. I mean, one debate is whether, this kind of transfer should be constrained in what you can do with the money, so in kind, essentially, like necessities, like food, rather than giving cash, which as economists, we say is always better because that leaves the freedom to people to do whatever they want and what's best for them. But of course, there is a big debate, right, with conditional versus unconditional transfers.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there is plenty of studies these days also in let's say the global south about providing this kind of transfers. And how do you think about the differences and the similarities in the results that researchers have found?
Yeah. So I think, in lower income countries, they tend to find larger effects, and that could be because there are more constraints initially to try to get through, that the cash really helps unlock. That could be part of it. It's also possible in the US context that some of the problems that people have if they're low income could actually be really thorny problems. So for example, like if you're taking care of a severely disabled child, I'm not sure that $1,000 a month even will help you that much with that, right? So it could be some combination of these things. Yeah.
Interesting. You went through a bunch of heterogeneous effects. One that people are asking about is gender. And I think that's also related to sort of the stereotypical roles of women and men in the house, within a household, and so on. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we didn't see too much with regards to gender differences per se, but we did see that single parents who are disproportionately female did reduce their labor supply by more. So, there's maybe something, with regards to that, but overall for the full sample, relatively weak differences there, I would say, compared to at least, some of the past literature. Yeah.
And COVID pandemic, what about it in the context of your studies, especially the effect on working hours and,
Absolutely. Yeah. So during the baseline period was when, the pandemic was at its peak. And so certainly the baseline survey, like when you saw that like 60% were employed at baseline, and then that rose to like 75% employed later, roughly, that's not necessarily, that everybody is working a little bit more compared to the baseline. And it's good that when we were asking about income as a screener, we were asking about the year before so that we weren't capturing people who were, just during the pandemic, temporarily unemployed or, temporarily low income. But definitely, I mean, I think, if you're concerned about the pandemic, in the paper, we break down the estimates a little bit more by time period. And, you might want to look more at year 2 or year 3, year 3 being 2023. I mean, by that point, it's probably, out of its safe. Did pre-specify that we're going to put more weight on the later time periods as well. So
I see. And moving from, big data to what sometimes people call anecdotes. Did you have a chance to talk to anyone who received this money? What was on top of their minds when thinking about these transfers?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, there's a study website that's really slick that was put together by Open Research.
I
Um,
see.
and they have even some stories from participants from
Mm,
qualitative interviews. So if anybody's interested, you can go there and listen to some people talk about, what they were using the
cool.
money for, their thoughts, including also some control group interviews. I think the big picture coming out from that is that people were using it for many different things, actually. Cash is fungible, like you were saying earlier.
Sure, sure. And so we talked a bit about the differences with, different contexts in terms of global north, global south, and so on. What about more specifically different institutional contexts, even within the US, for example? To what extent, what happened within that radius you mentioned is specific to certain circumstances as opposed to other contexts?
So let me tell you, we actually saw pretty starkly different differences in Texas than in Illinois, which
Huh.
was pretty interesting. Because oftentimes when you're doing a study, you only do it one place, and then everywhere else within the country says, "Oh, I can learn from that." But the results could be quite different, actually. So in Texas, there were much larger labor supply responses than in Illinois. And this could be, potentially, I mean, if you try to think of like what are the differences between Texas and Illinois, well, there are a lot of differences, so we can't really point to one thing. But it is true that Texas is, a fairly low benefit state overall. And there could be, certainly different, labor environments, et cetera. So I can't really pinpoint what it is, but that's the first major difference that comes to mind is yes, there does seem to be something here.
I see, I see. And do you know of any other attempts around the world to do something similar to what you guys have been doing, or programs that governments, local or
Mhm.
more, federal, if you want, are doing?
Yeah, so there have been a number of pilots that have started recently, some of which have results yet, some of which are still pending. So, for example, Baby's First Years was a program that they recently put out some employment results, I believe, where they their program was a little bit different. It was targeted at new moms essentially, and you received some cash on a card that was labeled "For My Baby." So it was a sort of a labeled transfer or a nudge in a
Nudge,
certain
yeah.
direction. Yeah. And it was also it was like 100 people in the treatment group in each of 4 cities. It ran for a long period of time, but had less money going out per month. So there are a few of these other pilots, and I definitely encourage people to look into it. I think we made a list, and there were actually something like 100 pilots in the U.S. going on, most of them very, very small scale. This and our other 2 studies, one in Chicago and one in Cook County, which Chicago is in, are the 3 largest studies. And in fact, all of our 3 studies are overlapping with each other in terms of geographies, right, around Chicago. And so it'll be really interesting later on to do more analysis of, okay, well, to what extent do these programs actually find the same effects versus different ones? The Chicago one was very similar, but it was $500 a month for 1 year. And Cook County was $500 a month for 2 years. So of course it wasn't randomized which of these 3 you were in, but like for 3 similar-ish cash transfer programs happening around the same time, around the same place, that'll be really interesting to dig into later.
When time's running out, I would stay here and ask questions for 2 more hours, but we just can't. So let me thank you, Eva, so much for leading this webinar. Just to conclude, the full recording of the webinar will be available on our website by clicking on the tab on the website that says webinars. And our next one will be on January 15th. We'll hear from Dave Hayes from the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada, FCAC. And in thanking you all for participating, just, you can exit the webinar by closing your Zoom screen. And I wish you a great rest of the day. Thanks, Eva. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.